Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. So we're back for part 2 of this First Act upgrade. This is a First Act M1972 from 2010. If you saw the last episode, I tore it down and we've been looking at the components. They actually look like a good basis for an upgrade. We're going to put some Geiger Pro tuners on it. We're going to put a Fender Player humbucker in it, some D'Addario end pins, a couple of Fender parts like this neck plate and the pot and the knob. We're doing a jack upgrade, a treble bleed circuit, a couple of switches, a new truss rod cover, and a few other things. Now I think I mentioned this before, but I was doing a little bit of repair work to the neck, and I think that's a good place to start. Now in the last episode I filled these tuner holes, but I never showed you the result. You can see there are some dark circles where the dowel rods went, but the main thing here was that I get everything nice and flat, so when I go to mount my new tuners I won't have any issues. If cosmetics were the point of this, I could have chosen a dowel rod made of some material that matched this wood a little bit better, but at the end of the day, cosmetics isn't really what matters here. We'll come back to the back of the headstock in just a minute, but let's focus on a little dent that I've got in the fretboard for now. It may not pick up too well on the camera, but I've got a dent here in the 4th fret area. It's pretty deep actually, but the way I'm going to address this is to get a little bit of water and dampen a small rag, and then steam this dent out with a soldering iron. It's really coming out of there nicely. I don't know if you can tell on the camera, but it's almost all the way raised out. Alright, I think that's enough steam and we can move on to something else. Next, let's get these D'Addario end pins out of the way. These things won't really interfere with anything else we're doing, so I just want to go ahead and take care of them now. Something else I'll install at the same time are a couple of new fender felts. Now I mentioned in the last video that I have a shielded cavity cover, but there is no shielding in the cavity. So I'm going to correct that by painting this with some shielding paint. I've got a quick tip video on how to make this stuff yourself if you're interested, but after you make it, you just paint it on. Now the factory holes for the headstock are sized for vintage tuners, and the modern style tuners require a bigger hole. So to prep these holes, what I do is clamp a board to the face of the headstock. That prevents a drill bit from flying all the way through this. It'll stop it just a little bit short. Then I drill a 13/32 hole into the back, and then if I have to re-drill the front side, I will to whatever size the bushing is on the tuners, but actually they happen to fit in this one just fine, so I can use the factory hole in the front and have a larger hole in the back. Next, let's drill a couple of holes for some extra switches for parallel and series and coil tapping. I've gone ahead and laid out where my line is that I want my switches to be on, and I've marked the locations of those switches with some pencil. It's just a matter of doing a center punch and a little drilling. Alright, I think that should be perfect, and the location is right where I want them. Skipping ahead just a little bit, I've gone ahead and mounted the pots and the switches, and I've got a couple things in here, the jack. As I always say, this wiring stuff is hard to catch on camera, so I'll try to give you pictures along the way. I've already got a picture of how well this pot fits along with these switches and how the jack wire is routed, so I'll post those and you can see them up close. Here's what the front looks like with the pots and the switches installed. I've still got some soldering to do, so I'm not going to put the knob on just yet, but the next thing I need to do is mount this humbucker. I've got a metal humbucker ring that I'm going to be using. The old one would have worked, but it's got a weird oval shape to it, so I just want to switch to something a little bit more rectangular. Now the holes don't exactly line up, so I've already filled the old holes with some toothpicks and I'm going to re-drill. Alright, now I'll remove this again and we can install the fender humbucker. Now it's been a little bit since you've seen the headstock, and I mentioned that I was going to do some modifications. So far, all I've really done is remove the finish on the face of the headstock, and I've replaced it with an antique oil finish from Minwax. It's a real simple wipe-on product. You wait about a day for it to dry, you can reapply another coat, and as you can see here, I've already started mounting the tuners as well. I don't have them screwed in from the back, but I do have them screwed in tightly from the front. Didn't bother with the straight edge this time. All I did was line them up by sight, try to put an equal amount of space in between the tuners, and they look pretty good to me as is. So now all that's left is to drill the holes to hold them in place on the back. Things are looking pretty good back here, and I'll get you a nice still picture of how these things look when they're installed. As we continue to inch forward here, I'm going to go ahead and mount the neck with the new Fender F neck plate. Alright, it's starting to look like a guitar again, but we've got a lot of wiring to finish up, and we've got to install that nut. As I tend to do with wiring, I've jumped ahead a little bit and I've gotten some stuff done. I'll show you some pictures of what the wiring looked like as soon as I finished it. But just in case you're wondering why I released a quick tip video last week about humbucker wire mapping, it was totally because of this guitar. I had to go through and figure out exactly the mapping of this Fender humbucker to get my mini switches to work right. And to be honest, I've come to the conclusion that no two Fender humbuckers are wired exactly the same, or at least the two that I got were not wired the same in terms of the colors. At any rate, I've got it wired the way I like it now, with the south coil on the bottom side of the pickup, and of course the coil tap and the parallel and series switches are working. And I've also installed this volume knob. While I was going through that whole wiring ordeal, I went ahead and rough mounted the nut, and I'll get a good picture of this for you. I didn't have to trim the nut to depth, I only had to trim it for width. I of course sanded down the height a little bit, but then I just put some slots in it, just like I always do. You hold up the old nut next to the new nut, draw some lines where the strings go, and then get your files out. I've kind of roughly filed everything down here, so I've got about 5 thousandths of clearance over the first fret when I run a straight edge from the second fret up to the nut slot. And something else you'll notice I did was I went ahead and cut out a truss rod cover from an old pick guard that I had laying around, so it's a unique shape. I decided that while I was going through all this work, I might as well do something a little custom for this guitar instead of just using the standard Epiphone truss rod cover. And I actually think it suits the shape of the headstock quite well. So the only thing left to do at this point is to go ahead and put some strings on this thing, then I can finish filing the nut for good. Oh, and by the way, just for good measure, I did a quick leveling and recrowning of the frets on this thing, and it really did need it a little bit down here above the 15th fret, but it was pretty uneventful otherwise. In a future video, I hope to give you a lot of close-ups and details on a re-level and crown, because even though I've done that on several projects, I never quite capture it in the way that I'd like to capture it, so maybe we'll do that as a future quick tip. Now, I'm sure you didn't come here to watch me string this guitar, so I'm going to show most of this to you in fast forward. I tend to do the bass strings with the guitar in one position and the treble side strings in a different position, just to make it easier for me because I'm right-handed. But before I finish these last two strings, let me just say, I got an interesting question from one of the viewers, and they were wondering what kind of sets of tuners that I actually bought to complete this headstock in the current configuration, where it has 2 right-handed tuners and 4 left-handed tuners. I responded that I bought 2 sets of 3+3 tuners. And that's essentially what I did. I just swapped 1 left-handed and 1 right-handed tuner in each set. But the viewer was asking me whether I bought a left-handed or right-handed set of 3+3 tuners, to which I replied, there is no difference. In a 3+3 set, you get 3 of each. Now while I finish these winds, there are a couple of things that are worth noting about this guitar. The first thing is, if you see me winding a lot, it's because these are 1:21 ratio tuners, and they take a lot of turns of the peg to accomplish the same amount of winds. The second is that I think the break angle on this headstock is actually quite nice, and I'm not having to fight to get each wrap of the string to go under the previous one on each tuner. Now once the strings are on, like I said, I can fine-tune my nut, but there's a lot of things that have to happen first. So first things first, tune everything up to pitch. The second thing I usually do is check out my neck relief. To do the leveling and crown that I did earlier, I set the neck really flat, and actually, after I tuned it up to pitch, it came up to just about the right amount of relief. That's not always the case if you touch the truss rod, and you probably should check it anyway, but just to let you know, that's usually where I go first. Then I rough in the action. In my case, I try to set the action around 4/64 at the 17th fret. The reason I want my action close is because I'm going to be measuring that distance over the first fret when I'm filing my nut, and if it's way off down here, it's going to be off up here. Not as much, but it will be off. So the process from then on is to use my feeler gauge to check the distance over the first fret, then I'll detune each string, file it a little bit more, because remember I was already close, then put it back on, tune it up to pitch, and hopefully it doesn't take me too many times having to do that before I get to around 18 thousandths of space over the first fret. Once I've done all 6 strings, at that point I go back and set my action for real. I use the same spec, but it's going to have moved since I fine-tuned the nut. From there I usually set pickup height, and intonation. Sometimes I'll do intonation and then pickup height. Those last two things don't matter quite so much, but you need to do both before this thing's ready to play. When all that's set, a once over doesn't hurt, just to check neck relief, action, and pickup height one more time. And then something I always like to do as a final step, just to make sure that I don't have any problems, is to check out all of my high notes and make sure I don't have any dead spots from any of the work I did previously. Well, all my notes rang out, so now it's really just down to a quick test to play it a little bit. Alright, as we wrap up, let me give you a couple of clips of this guitar, and each one of these is going to be the same sequence, played with the humbucker in full series, then played with coil tap, then played in parallel. I think you'll be able to hear the high output in series, the single coil style output when it's tapped, and then the kind of unique sound you get with the parallel wiring. And while we're playing here, I'll give you a nice close-up shot of the guitar, front and back. Well, thank you all for hanging out for one more build. This one was really simple but really enjoyable at the same time, and I'm really impressed with how it came out for such an inexpensive guitar. I think somebody could easily replicate one of these with just about the same parts for somewhere around $100, definitely less than $150 all in. And again, this thing has a lot of upgrades. Remember, we did strap buttons, we did all the electronics, we've got a Fender player humbucker, a new humbucker ring, new strings, new nut, truss rod cover, and tuners. So there's quite a bit of stuff that's in this guitar for that price. Anyway, if you're interested in the parts, go check out my Amazon and eBay links. You might find some deals there for yourself. And again, you'll find those in the description, along with a link to my Hacks Guitar Hobby Facebook group if you want to come chat. Thanks for all the likes and the comments. I really appreciate the subscriptions, and I'll see you guys next time.